Good morning, everybody. Absolute pleasure to be here. And I want to spend just a few minutes talking to you about our UK Cities Recovery Index. As we went into this extraordinary period back in March, we started thinking about how was the lockdown, how was the pandemic affecting the UK, how was it affecting our cities? And conventional ways of looking at the market really just don't cut it. They didn't allow us to get a fine-grained sense of really how things were evolving. We needed to look for other measures. And so, in common with some other people, we started looking at various high-frequency indicators of activity, flight movements, restaurant bookings, the numbers of people going to different parts of the city, footfall data, and anything that we could really get our hands on. The problem is that all of this data kind of tells you about numbers of flight arrivals or people walking around, but it all comes in very different patterns and it doesn't really present a clear picture. And the data all comes in different formats. So the first thing we had to do once we got all the data together was just try and get it all into a standard format, take out some of the weekly and the seasonal variations. We were really trying to look for data that was published quite regularly and frequently and ideally down to daily or at worst weekly frequency. So we spent a lot of time working through and standardizing all of that data, putting it all into index form, indexing it back to the end of February, which we took as being kind of the onset of the pandemic. And when we put it all together, the problem was that a lot of this data sort of, there seem to be some patterns in there, but it doesn't really show a clear picture. So we spend a lot of time cleaning it up and trying to identify some groupings and putting it into a format that we could make some sense of. And this at the highest level is what we came up with. So the line here is our national UK cities, what we call recovery index. It measures the level of activity, the sorts of activity that we see going on across the major cities in the UK. And set against that in the shaded area is the number of hospitalizations indexed to its peak level at 100 for the UK. We think hospitalizations is and most consistent metric that you can use to get a handle on kind of the scale of the pandemic in the UK. And you can see from the index how activity declined very sharply once lockdown started, then bounced around, recovering very slowly, but only very gradually, up until Super Saturday, the beginning of July, when pubs and restaurants were allowed to reopen. Activity picked up quite sharply and then got another boost in August with Eat Out to help out. But then from the start of September, schools went back. Activity then gradually dropped off again. The recovery sort of slowed down. And the numbers of infections started to rise, number of hospitalizations started to rise. And that's what led, of course, to a quite sharp increase in hospitalizations and then the new lockdown that started a few weeks ago that you can see quite sharply. So we can see the pattern in the index absolutely making sense with our experience and what we've been seeing. A national index is one thing. We wanted to be able to drill down a bit more fine-grained and actually look at how different cities were being impacted. So now the grey area here is that overall UK index. Each line represents a different city. And you can see there are some variations in there, some bumps early on from the two Scottish cities. But broadly speaking, cities tending to follow a similar pattern, but with some differences, which we'll just dig into a little bit as we go through. If you're interested in following up, we have built an entire website that allows you to look at each of the city indices and the sector indices in more detail. There's quite a lot of description as to how we've put the index together. It's updated with some commentary every week. You can access all of this at avisonyoung.co.uk, and there are some interactive charts that you can have a play with as well. So let's have a look at some of the things that we think that the index is telling us and some of the things that we think that we've been able to get out of it. So we can start by just looking at Birmingham versus the UK, focus in a bit on the West Midlands. Here you can see there are two shaded areas, and that shows that the hospitalisation levels indexed back to their peak. The peak was at pretty much in Birmingham, pretty much coincided in the West Midlands coincided with what we saw nationally, and broadly the pattern of the infection has mirrored what we've seen across the country as a whole, just a slight increase uptick coming through in the last couple of weeks. Similarly, our recovery index, actually Birmingham, one of the cities that has tracked very close to the national pattern, and again you can see quite clearly in the last couple of weeks the index just taking that dip as lockdown bit and then stabilizing. Again, this is an overall representation, and clearly it's going to be helpful to dig in a bit more detail to how different types of activity have been affected, because what we wanted to try and do was to get behind how different aspects of the city were being impacted negatively during the lockdowns, and particularly how fast and how far things have been recovering. So we've also got what we call sub-indices, sector indices, reflecting different groupings of these high frequency indicators. They're obviously not a perfect representation because there's only so much data out there that is publicly available or accessible and that's produced on this sort of daily or weekly basis. But we've tried to group the indicators that we have got into a number of categories that give us an insight as to how different aspects of the economy are performing. So commercial activity includes some employment and unemployment data, includes the Purchasing Managers Index, indicators of consumer sentiment, and also commercial vehicle movement, some other things that reflect sort of what we think of as commercial activity. Hotel and leisure includes hotel bookings, restaurant bookings, travel to leisure venues. The mobility indicates a variety of different mobility indices out there that reflect how much people are moving around, how much mobility there is within the population as a whole. The residential grouping includes various indicators of residential market activity, including numbers of new listings, numbers of transactions and energy performance certificates and other things that are reflective of residential market activity. Retail includes movement in and around retail destinations and footfall counts and travel to different types of retail locations. And return to office, trying to capture from a particular perspective that we're interested in, trying to capture the extent to which office activity and people have been returning to work and returning to the office. And so if we then dive in and look at what's happening in Birmingham, you can see now there really is quite a lot of variation between the different sector indices. So at the top, for example, we have commercial activity, which certainly in Birmingham has consistently held up pretty well. The industrial nature of the economy and the strong logistics presence in the Midlands, meaning that we've seen quite a lot of the commercial activity in and around Birmingham hold up quite well. The residential market taking a hit initially, but as soon as viewings and activity were allowed, and then particularly once stamp duty holiday was implemented, we've seen quite a sharp and sustained pickup in the residential market. Elsewhere, some other aspects performing less strongly. So quite clearly you can see restaurants and hotel and leisure and general mobility taking the biggest hit early on. Mobility gradually recovering in the pattern that we saw in line with the overall national index, but hotel and leisure really nailed to the floor, an important part of the Midlands economy, nailed to the floor until that beginning of July, when then we saw quite a sharp recovery, but nevertheless still an aspect of city life that really hasn't yet got anywhere near back to its full position. And we can see how Birmingham and the West Midlands have been performing relative to other cities. You probably can't see the detail here, but we can see how different indicators have moved across the 10 cities that we monitor, and particularly how Birmingham has fared relative to those. So in the West Midlands, we've seen quite strong activity from a commercial point of view, and then the West Midlands, as we saw, just tracking along with broadly in line with national averages in the middle of the pack. So what else can we see and what can we do with this? Well, looking at the mobility data in more detail, here you can see through February through to October, some snapshots, how mobility really declined very sharply in April, but then picked up again as we came through the summer and into the autumn in most parts of the country. But you can see those major conurbations, the major cities, really picked out as having a stronger impact. The biggest reductions in mobility have been seen in the major cities. And if we dig down within the West Midlands, you can see the same thing true here. As you came through comparing just May, June and July, so the end of the lockdown period through June into July, we saw Birmingham, Solihull, Coventry, Warwick more severely impacted, the more urbanised, denser areas more severely impacted from a mobility point of view, and still evident right now than the surrounding locations. So what does this tell us? So we know that activity has been impacted. We didn't actually set out specifically to try and replicate what was happening with GDP, but actually with monthly and regional GDP data being made available, we have actually been able to compare, looking back at our national index, compare it with the GDP data coming through. And you can see that this is very much work in progress, but even the index as it is at the moment, without specifically reweighting it to try and model GDP, looks as though it's a pretty good leading indicator of what's happening in the economy. And so we can start to use that to infer what's happening. So we've been looking, for example, at comparisons between Bristol and Cardiff, which, whereas English Welsh rugby supporters may argue there is an enormous difference between them, clearly, they're only a few miles apart. And actually, as we came through the year, the patterns of mobility that we saw pretty similar until the Welsh markets started to go into closer lockdown. And in fact, if we compare the two indices at overall level between Cardiff and Bristol, you can see they tracked each other very closely until we started seeing lockdowns and restrictions being imposed on Wales that weren't present in Bristol. And then we see a divergence between the two indices. And we actually used this to model what would we expect the Cardiff index to have looked like following what happened in Bristol, so using Bristol to forecast Cardiff effectively. And our argument is that the difference between the Cardiff forecast and what actually happened is actually reflecting the specific impact of the Welsh lockdown. And that's helpful because what it allows us to do is to see what would the impact of the lockdown be, and then enabled us, using that and statistical analysis, to forecast what we thought the impact of the national lockdown in England was going to be on the national index and therefore by extension on economic activity. And our forecast based on Cardiff suggested that there was going to be somewhere around a 15% impact on the index, which would translate into a sort of 5 or 6% impact on GDP. In fact, once we started getting the data through, we had slightly overestimated the impact. All the signs are that the GDP impact, that the impact on the economy and the impact on our index has not been as severe as we thought, which is clearly very positive from an economic point of view. It does raise questions as to whether or not we're seeing as much. We know there haven't been as many restrictions in place. Whether or not we're going to see anything like the same sort of impact coming through on the rates of hospitalizations. And as that gets released and relaxed as we move through into the Christmas period, it's quite possible that there are going to have to be more restrictions afterwards. But what is clear, and what we can say, and we've done some modelling work on Birmingham, is that the positive thing is that we expect to see far less of an economic impact coming through on this occasion as a result of the lockdown. And indeed, we expect the West Midlands economy to actually recover reasonably strongly afterwards because activity is likely to pick up again pretty quickly as soon as those restrictions are lifted. So that was really a lightning run through the index and how we think it can be applied. There is lots more information available on the website. If you want more details, please do get in touch. But hopefully that's given something of an insight as to what's going on right now with the lockdown and where we may be headed over the next few months.